on the military perspective for a second. If we can say, and for the sake of this argument, let's just say that nuclear escalation can be avoided, and we'll see how that works out. But just from a military conventional perspective, it seems to me that in the modern era, of course, air and missile power is absolutely essential and crucial and vital. But it's also not enough. I think you've said several times you still have to have a land force because you can't take and hold terrain unless you have somebody on the ground. You can throw missiles all over the place, but you can't gain anything. So my concern is, or my question rather, is on what basis does Israel want to fight with Lebanon, in southern Lebanon? Now they can, because they can physically go and take ground there. But if you also drag in Iran into it, you can throw a bunch of missiles, but you're not going to go and take Iran, especially this tiny little Israel, even if they got us fully engaged. So what is the end state that even is achievable for Israel to not have a permanently hostile Iran if they go into war with them?
Well, the Israeli end state is Greater Israel, as a minimum, what we described earlier, and they think that's achievable. That may be. I don't know. I have my doubts, but that's their firm conviction. No one is interested in taking and holding anything, least of all Americans. There's nothing to take and hold that's of any real value to us. I think the interest is in destroying Iran, not holding it, not utilizing it or exploiting it, but destroying it.
Right, but
Iran is a large country.
We can't destroy Iran, right? I mean, we can cause lots of damage, but we can't destroy it just with air and missile power, right?
Well, you can do it. You can do an awful lot of damage. You have to look at where the population of Iran is actually concentrated. Much of Iran is desert and mountain, where there frankly isn't much. It's an area larger than Western Europe. So look at where the 79 million Iranians live. It's not very difficult to destroy their water supply, destroy their power grid, destroy ultimately over time their armed forces. That can be done. Now, it's not going to be easy. They're going to fight back, and they have some capability now that they did not years ago. And I'm talking about their ability to reach out and touch us, to attack our 26 bases in the region and kill Americans. There's no doubt about it. But you can do so much damage that you create another wave of refugees and migrants that start going where? Well, they'll pour into Turkey. They're going to go north. They're going to try and go into Europe. They're not going to sit there and be destroyed, starve to death, or end up dying for lack of water. I mean, you can inflict those kinds of damages. You don't need to go into the country. And I think the Air Force is probably, and the Navy, salivating at the prospect, because that's what they've always theorized could be done. You can win a war without any ground force. Well, if your only goal is destruction and murder, they have a point, because there's no reason why we would want to intervene on the ground in Iran. There's nothing there for us. Why are we doing it? So we are essentially extending the range and capability of Israeli striking power, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so forth. That's what we're doing. And that can do a lot of damage. Now, we haven't discussed who else may object to the total destruction of the Iranian state and the mass destruction of its people. There are other states out there that are not going to be particularly excited about that. Clearly, the Pakistanis are not going to be excited. I don't think India will be excited by it. I know the Russians are going to be horrified if that happens. And again, we come back to Turkey. Turks aren't going to like it. If you go to Northeast Asia, it's not just the Chinese who want access to the Straits of Hormuz, which would likely be closed. It's also Japan, Korea, a number of other states in the region that depend on access to those fossil fuels. In other words, this has global impact. The impact is not just in the region, it's global, and it's going to be economic, it's going to be political and military. And at some point, we may discover that we're up against far, far more adversaries and opponents than we reckoned would be the case.
Okay.
Again, and so you got to distinguish the desired end state, which is Greater Israel, from what is possibly going to happen that's very different from that end state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, and then there's another big, like blinking red problem for the United States in here. So we've seen Israel with when they had the Gaza Strip, which is encased in a little chain link fence, basically, and so everything was contained in there. And with all the IDF has at its disposal, 10 months later, they're still having to fight there. So the idea that they would then go up north into to the Hezbollah, where they have more troops, more defenses, et cetera, and have anything quick is just not even possible. So you're talking about if they do, that's going to start a long lead time kind of an issue that also could be open-ended. But United States is already in a position to where our ammunition stocks are running critically low. And there was a report out just a couple of days ago that when somebody looking at the China-Taiwan issue, if we had to fight China, that we could run out of critical supplies within days in some of the interceptor missiles and within a few weeks in many of the other key aspects of the ammunition. And that's just in that one area there. If we start still trying to support Ukraine with what we've been doing there, what we claim, while we now then have to spike in our efforts to help Israel down in this area and our own, especially if we get dragged into it, Doug, we don't have enough ammunition to last a long fight there. Forget about all these other areas that may fight. We just don't have the capacity.
But you have to weigh what you've just said, and I don't disagree with anything that you've noted, but you have to weigh that particular analysis against the analysis that is current in Washington and Jerusalem. And that analysis is there is no incentive to wait. This is the time to strike. If there were ever a point in Israel's history where it has the chance to establish its unchallenged supremacy in the region, it's now. All of its surrounding neighbors are very weak. We're talking about the Arab states. They're very weak. There's very little that they can do. They may have numbers, they may have large numbers of equipment, but they're not oriented to offensive warfare, and there's not much they can do to intervene to change things. If they could, they'd have already done it. So that means that within the region, your principal concern, other than Hezbollah, is Iran, and they dismiss out of hand the possibility that Turkey will ever do anything. I mean, that's the conventional wisdom in Israel. No, the Turks won't intervene. We can ignore that. It's sort of similar to the Germans in 1914, who absolutely did not believe that the British would intervene. You know, similar mentality. So from their vantage point, you're never going to have a better shot because you really have now, if you're Mr. Netanyahu sitting in Jerusalem, you have absolute control of the United States Armed Forces and its capacities. But you're a realist. You know, that's not going to last forever. You don't know what the next election is going to bring. Yeah, sure, you've essentially bought what I call the right wing of the Uniparty, which we call Republican. That's purchased, but is it reliable over the long haul? May or may not be. Then you have the left wing of the Uniparty under Kamala Harris. You've got serious reservations about it because they call themselves the party of color. They're distinctly racist in their attitudes towards white people, and they don't like Israel. So, you know, you got to put yourself in the position of Mr. Netanyahu, and you say, if I have to pick a point in time to do this, this is it. So let's pull out all the stops. Let's go for broke, and we can win everything at one stroke. Okay. See how that works out.
Yeah, you know, it's ironic because from a certain perspective, I observe the same thing, especially diplomatically. They'll never have another chance to actually launch into stuff and have muted if or no response, you know, to some of these actions, et cetera, and the support of the United States. But we keep getting back into that thing you talk about for most of your career about ends and means. And so, yeah, you may want to accomplish this, but if you don't have the capacity to do so, to go starting on that road without the ability to rationally bring it to a conclusion, I mean, you're setting yourself up for disaster. And to me, there is no prospect that Israel can actually militarily conquer this territory, even using the U.S. Armed Forces, before we run out of capacity, or there's so many more enemies join in and we can't match them all. This is a suicide mission to me, Doug.
Well, remember the Tsar of Russia went through a similar calculation at the beginning of World War I. And the Russian general staff convinced the Tsar that his army was so enormous and he had so many troops, so many forces, that the Germans would simply be overwhelmed and run out of manpower and be incapable of fighting against Russia, that the Russians would overwhelm them. And he signed on for the calculation. If you look at the numbers and some of the underpinning assumptions, you could make a good argument for what he said. Of course, it ignored everything else. It ignored technology. It ignored the nature of the Germans and their training and their education and their leadership and so forth. There's something else that your viewers should consider doing, and that is on the internet. You can Google it, and you can actually listen to about 10 minutes of a transcript. A conversation was captured in Finland in 1942 between Adolf Hitler and Field Marshal von Mannerheim, who was the commander-in-chief of Finnish forces and the leader of Finland at the time. And Adolf Hitler had flown in to see Mannerheim. I think the occasion was Mannerheim's birthday. I don't remember. But it's a wonderful 10 minutes. It's very revealing because you hear him not as this persona we see in the newsreels, but as a normal human being speaking. And one of the things that Hitler says, he tells Mannerheim, we were astonished when we overran the Ukraine and reached Kharkov and these other places. We found factories where they were producing 30, 40,000 tanks, where we saw hundreds of thousands of people who were effectively slaves working in these factories. He said, good Lord, who in their right mind builds 40 or 50,000 tanks in peacetime? For Hitler, this was incomprehensible. And then he said something that's very, very important to remember. He said, if we had known this, we wouldn't have invaded Russia. We wouldn't have gone into the Soviet Union. Well, wow. What is the logical conclusion if you realize the gravity of his statement? The logical conclusion is stop, pull back, cut a deal. This is bigger than you thought. You may win at the moment, but long term, the prospects are bad. Well, there was no thinking about that. Napoleon Bonaparte reached Smolensk, and he held a council of war in 1812. And he said, I think we've gone far enough. I think we should turn back. This is ridiculous. He actually said that. You can read it. His adjutant wrote it up. And it was his generals and his marshals who said, oh, no, we're too close now. We need to march on. Bonaparte said, why? And they gave him all these reasons. And grudgingly, after 2 or 3 hours of discussion, he relented and said, all right, we'll march on to Moscow. He realized this was a dumb idea. So the real question is, why do people double down on dumb ideas even when they realize it's a dumb idea? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. There's a whole psychology behind it. I think that that's going to happen to Mr. Netanyahu and his friends. I think they're going to realize that. I think people in Washington are going to end up in a very similar position. We didn't sign up for this. We didn't expect this. Well, what are we going to do now? And everybody's going to say exactly what you heard when you were in Afghanistan, what I heard about Iraq. I remember having these conversations, and General Petraeus, I was visiting in November 2005 in Leavenworth. And he said, well, what do you think about Iraq? I said, I think we should leave. And he said, oh, we can't just leave. But, the point is we always do. You can't just leave. Oh, yes, you can. What did we do? We ultimately left. What are we going to do now in the face of what's happening at the conclusion of these hostilities with all of these penny packets of troops all over the region? Whatever's alive at the end, we're just going to leave. There's nothing there for us. There never was. So what are we doing here? When a friend of mine used to say, Doug, when you have no strategy, in other words, when there's no purpose, method, end state, when you haven't thought anything through, you end up in a place called Stalingrad. And you look around and say, okay, now what?
Yeah.
I think that's where we're headed collectively.
That's exactly what I fear. You just put more eloquently than